Hello and welcome to the next webinar brought to you by Strengthening the Heartland. This is the first webinar and I guess I'll call it this season's webinar series. So we're very excited to talk about creative strategies. If you have been with us before, welcome back. If you are new here, welcome also. And I have a few just housekeeping logistics announcements for you so that you can know what to expect as we're together for the next hour. So the first thing is that you'll see a panel on your screen, and if you would like to follow along with the presentation, there is a handout posted there. Feel free to download. You are also encouraged to ask questions throughout the presentation. You'll be able to do that in the questions spot on your panel. Just a note that you won't see questions from other attendees. Those just come to us as moderator and presenter, but we will keep track of those. And then we typically respond to them at the end of the presentation. But feel free to enter them at any time as things come up during the presentation. And then lastly, if you are interested in learning more about the programming and opportunities available through Strengthening the Heartland, please feel free to sign up for our email list, and a link just popped up in the chat for you. We only send things out when we have opportunities to share, so we will not fill up your inbox, but if you have any interest, please sign up, please share that list widely. We're really happy to build our network and get these resources out to lots of people. So with that, I will introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Kyndel Tarziers is with us, and she is going to talk a little bit more about creative strategies. Welcome, Kyndel. So happy to have you with us.
Thank you, Amber. I am excited to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen share so that everybody can see what we have going on. So today I'm really excited to talk to you all about creative approaches that we can utilize in counseling spaces, but specifically to engage child and adolescent populations. So I thought I would start with just a little bit about myself. I am currently an assistant professor at the University of West Georgia. I teach in both our school counseling and our clinical mental health counseling programs. I have a master's degree from the University of South Alabama in clinical mental health counseling, and then my PhD is in counselor education and practice, and that is through Georgia State University. So once I graduated from my PhD, I actually went into the educational space, and now I teach. But in addition to the teaching that I do, I also work in a clinical space in a private practice in Atlanta called Root and Blossom Counseling. And so there I work with mainly children and adolescents, but I also have a hand in seeing some adults and doing parent education and parent consultation sessions. And so I really love being able to keep a clinical focus while I also teach, because a lot of the clinical focus in my work informs the teaching that I do. And so as a professor, I oftentimes teach our child and adolescent course. So when the opportunity came up for me to talk about creativity in a counseling space today, it was really exciting for me. And you might notice that I've kind of put up these just pictures of things rather than a long dialogue about myself. And I do that because this is a way that I like to check in with my clients and with my students in classes. And so oftentimes I will have students share about themselves by sharing some pictures that kind of speak to them or speak to things that they do. I will also have clients sometimes pick out pictures that I have in my office that speak to their interest areas or that maybe just align with like how they're feeling that day. And we talk through pictures, and I get to learn more about them through their interest in the pictures that they choose. And so for me, this has always been a cool way just to get to know people. It provides a visual, and it sometimes is a little bit more interesting than just reading a short dialogue about somebody. So you'll see that there's the West Georgia emblem as well as the Root and Blossom emblem. But in addition to that, I also do some service within our field that's specifically focused on child and adolescent counseling. So I'm currently the Emerging Leaders Chair for the Child and Adolescent Counseling Division of ACA. And so in that division, we really focus on enhancing practice within child and adolescent counseling. And through the Emerging Leaders program, we work with students that are currently in their master's or doctoral level programs, and give them opportunities to network within the field, as well as other kind of professional development opportunities related to presenting and writing. And so it's always really interesting for me to get to know more students, and it's a really good way to stay connected to the literature and the research that's going on within our field. So that's a little bit about kind of my clinical and educational backgrounds. A little bit about me personally. I included some paw prints because I have a mini golden doodle that normally is present with me, but she's skipping out on the lecture today. But her name is Maisie, and she is a big source of energy and fun in my life. I utilize running as a form of self-care and really engage in that practice really often to help keep myself grounded and maintained in the work that I do. And then I included a picture of cookies because I like to bake, but I also like to eat cookies. So baking is one of the things that I like to do in my free time, and it's kind of an outlet for me in this work. And so we're not going to talk too much today about self-care, but I always like to give that as a caveat that self-care is important in the work that we do, especially when we're working with child and adolescent populations, because some of the work that we have to do is teach them how to engage in productive self-care practice. So I am a big believer in practicing that myself. So today we're going to go over our learning objectives, discuss importance of creativity, consider some of the different considerations that go into working with child and adolescent populations. We're going to talk about what you're here to get, creative approaches and application. We're going to review some work with caregivers, and then we'll kind of close things out, and I'll provide you with some last minute reminders and of course some resources that I hope will be beneficial to you in your future work. So as far as learning objectives go, we're going to discuss how we can utilize creative approaches to help increase participation in the counseling space, improve rapport, and foster communication. And that can be both with the client and with their parents. My hope is that after leaving today, you'll be able to identify some different creative approaches that you can use to engage youth of all ages in therapeutic settings. There also might be some things that you could take as far as utilizing with adults as well. And then we're also going to discuss adaptation and implementation of creative interventions based on age appropriateness and culturally sensitive approaches for different youth populations. Some quick reminders before we actually jump into things. I always like to say this stuff because it's easy to think about how we might utilize all of these things in this one context, but there really is there's no one size fits all when it comes to working with children and adolescents. You kind of just have to meet them where they're at and see what's going to work best for them, because every child that you see is different. And so even if they share very similar backgrounds or identities, they might have had a different life experience that then impacts the way in which they show up in your counseling office. Based on that, it's always important that we consider different ethical, multicultural, and developmental considerations that might arise in this work. And through kind of thinking about these considerations, we're going to work to try to find an approach that fits for you. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that I faced when I started the work that I do with children and adolescents was finding an approach that felt true to who I was and true to me. And so as I continue to evolve in my own work and get more experience under my belt, I think that approach continues to really hone in and change based on the things that are important to me in the time that I'm working with my clients. But I also utilize ethical frameworks and consultation to help build out what my own approach looks like and to provide the best level of care to the clients that I work with. So why is creativity important? What are we here to talk about? Creativity can be used in lots of different ways in the counseling process because it's really at the heart of what we do. Creativity can help both the counselor and the client gain new perspective. And it's just a way of being, really, sitting with a client that can facilitate change in the counseling relationship. Because when we're exploring creativity, it really requires us to be more open-minded. It requires us to experiment. It requires us to play a little bit, which is actually super important in the work that we do with children and adolescents. And it requires us to enter the unknown. So what does that even mean? I mean, creativity can force us into spaces of uncomfortability. And so sometimes we don't know what the outcome is going to be of something that we do in the counseling space that is a creative or expressive activity. And so that not knowing, that space of just uncertainty, can actually challenge a growth focused mindset in the counseling space. Creativity can also assist the client or the child in thinking, feeling, sensing, imagining, and behaving differently. And so we can utilize these different creative approaches, which we'll talk more about, and we'll talk about some specific approaches to help them think about the way that they do things. Like when they see or when they're forced to engage with material in the counseling space that really pushes on their comfort zone or their levels of comfortability, it can encourage them to think in different ways and potentially even behave in different ways. It can also offer variety into the counseling setting. I know that for me, if I were to go into this space as a child every week and I was doing the same thing and I was just trying to talk to an adult, I would find that to probably be really overwhelming as a child or an adolescent. So infusing creativity in the space can offer a lot of variety to the children and adolescents that we see. It can also challenge rigidity. So sometimes when I'm working with children, and we'll get to this point a little bit later in the presentation, but children have an expectation of how their art is supposed to look or how their activity is supposed to be completed. And so by infusing creativity, we're not putting any boundaries around what our expectations are in the counseling space. So it can help with managing kind of expectations that are not attainable, but it can also help us to challenge rigidity that children might face in their day-to-day life if they have like a big expectation of exactly how something is supposed to look. The other beauty of infusing creativity is that we start to look at process over outcome. And so sometimes these projects that we do in the counseling space, the creative interventions that we utilize, they don't turn out exactly as we thought that they might. And that actually is sometimes a really great strength of creativity in this space, because we might be able to learn more from the process of doing the activity than the actual outcome of the activity. And so as you start to think about how you might utilize creativity in your space, I think that these are important things for us to remember, because they offer a new way of thinking about how we might utilize the counseling space to benefit our client. And if we can utilize creativity in that space, maybe we can really push their level of comfortability and help them build a stronger window of tolerance for things that are outside of like their known world, to help them kind of enter the unknown spaces that can be really scary for children and adolescents. So as we start to think about infusing creativity, what are considerations that we need to keep in mind? We have to be mindful of developmental frameworks, because that is going to impact the different kinds of creative interventions that we choose to utilize in our work. So I've included 3 for us to kind of look over today, but these are the 3 that I most commonly use, but I'll also pull in other theoretical and developmental frameworks to situate the work that I do with clients. So sometimes I speak with clients or parents about zones of proximal development, like Vygotsky's work, but I oftentimes will focus in on psychosocial development, cognitive development, and then Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. And so for me, my counseling approach really looks at development and the importance of development in the counseling space. So I oftentimes go back a lot to the psychosocial development of children. And most of the children that I see, if you're looking at Erik Erikson's model, they fall within that early childhood to adolescent stage. And so we're looking in those stages at initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, or figuring out kind of a sense of self, and then identity versus identity confusion. Who am I? What is my role? What's my purpose in this space? And so as I utilize creative interventions, I think about these developmental frameworks to kind of situate the work that I do. Is this creative intervention going to developmentally be appropriate for this child? When I'm working with children in early childhood, I'm probably going to employ the intervention in a different way than I would if I was working with an adolescent. Early childhood, it's going to be more of a challenge potentially to address like abstract reasoning, and that's based on cognitive development. So maybe I'm going to utilize interventions that might require a higher level of abstract reasoning And I'm going to reserve those for my work with adolescent clients versus maybe some of my early childhood clients. I'm going to utilize more expressive arts activities to help them express emotions in ways that might be challenging for them to express verbally. We could maybe express through other avenues. So as I think about exactly what happens in each of those psychosocial developmental stages, I'm also thinking about the cognitive development of the child. Where are they at? What cognitive skills do they have? And oftentimes I'm working within the pre-operational to formal operational stages. I oftentimes really only see children like 4 and up. And so that's going to put me into these 3 stages. And so in the pre-operational stage, abstract thought is still really difficult, but we're seeing a lot of imagination in this stage. And so when we're utilizing creativity in that space, we want to play into the fact that children within the stage of cognitive development do have just a vast imagination. And so those that imaginative skill can be used to their benefit in the counseling space. In that 7 to 11-year age, we start to see more concrete thought. And so this might be where sometimes you struggle with children who are really thinking in forms of like black and white thinking, where it's either one way or it's not. And creativity is a great way, again, to challenge that, because sometimes it's not black and white with creative things. There's no right or wrong way to do some of the creative activities that we do. Or maybe there's multiple avenues for how these things could be completed. So this is a great stage in which we can really challenge that concreteness of thought and help them think about different ways that they might address problems that they're experiencing. And then lastly, formal operational stages of cognitive development is when children are coming into that ability to have more abstract logic and reasoning. So they might be able to strategize different things. They might be able to work through problem solving, and concepts learned in one context can be applied into other contexts. And so in this space, we might see more work with adolescents and their ability to really think through different creative interventions and abstractly consider future self and other things that may be more future oriented. So again, all of this goes into the way that I utilize creativity in this space. And then lastly, if we're looking at the ecological model, I think that this is so helpful because it situates where the child is at in the broader scheme of systems. They're within their immediate environment. They're within connections between those environments. They live within an exosystem or indirect environment. Then they're kind of at the whim of social and cultural spaces in this bigger macro system. And then the chronosystem looks at the changes over time. And so it can be helpful to think about the different systems in which the child is in to better situate different work that you might do with them. And I would encourage you to utilize some of these resources that I have listed here, because they can help explain this in the developmental framework a little bit more clearly than what we have time for today. So what are some multicultural and diversity considerations? So if you're thinking about the different bubbles of considerations that you might consider in your work with children and adolescents, one being developmental frameworks, another is multicultural or diversity considerations. And so what you also want to do here is consider intersectionality and impacts of cultural identity so that you can utilize different strategies to address your own identity and potential bias that you may hold in that space. At the very least, coming into this counseling space in your work with children and adolescents, you oftentimes have a difference in age. Sometimes that's quite broad difference in age, sometimes it's small, but still with the privilege of age in that space sometimes comes power. And so how are we differentiating and breaking down the power differential in the counseling space so that children feel like it's their space to utilize? And some of that can be through just thinking through the fact that you might have some kind of power coming into that space inherently. So that might be through age, but it could also be through other demographic factors or other aspects of your cultural identity. So one thing that I utilize really frequently is the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies to kind of reflect on the different ways that privileged identities that I hold might impact the work that I do with clients through thinking through knowledge, skills, and awareness, which I would encourage you, if you're not familiar with that, to take a look at it. But the other thing that I utilize is this identity wheel. And so sometimes if I'm really getting stuck with a client, I'll work through my own identities in this wheel. And then I'll also do a wheel that encompasses the different clients' identities and think through what are similarities and what are differences within our identities, and maybe what could be compounding or causing challenge in our relationship. Are there specific aspects of identity that I'm missing that might be really important in my work with this child, adolescent, or family. And so as I hold all the pieces of developmental consideration, I'm also thinking through multicultural considerations that might impact the work that I'm doing with this child or impact how the child shows up in that space. And then lastly, I'm working through ethical considerations and being mindful that with the work that you do with children and adolescents come a lot of ethical considerations to be mindful of. So what are the big kind of things that you might want to be thinking about? Well, firstly, let's hope that we're applying ACA ethical codes. That is what should be guiding the work that we do with clients. And so I've only listed a few here. I probably could have listed 100 different ethical codes, but you really want to think about the fact that children don't have an ability to give consent to the counseling relationship. They're giving assent. And so we're getting informed consent from the parent, but we should also be getting assent from the child and talking to them about what they are going to expect from that space and what the limits to confidentiality are in that space, because they look different for children and adolescents than they do for adults. So that kind of brings us to point 2, which is looking at respect for confidentiality, because we want that space to be sacred for the child or the adolescent, and we want them to feel like it's their own. And sometimes that can be really challenging when you're working with parents that want to be really involved. So we do have a responsibility to parents and legal guardians to inform them of, things that are warranted for them to know in the counseling relationship. But I try to set up front some really good boundaries with parents and guardians around what they can expect from me in the work that I do with their child. And this sometimes looks like more information for younger children and less for older, but I give that kind of piece of knowledge up front. I'm also thinking about boundaries of competence. So a lot of times the work that I do with children and adolescents focuses around anxiety, depression. I do some work with neurodiverse populations, and then I also do a lot of trauma work. But sometimes there are issues that are outside of that realm of competence for me, and that's when I'm doing a lot of referring out. And so you want to be mindful of when to or when to not take on a client, and thinking through ethical decision making. I utilize the Forrester, Miller, and Davis ethical decision-making model to kind of work through these challenges as they arise. But I include that here because sometimes it does impact our decision to utilize certain interventions in the counseling space. And then I can't speak enough to the importance of consultation and supervision. Although I'm a fully licensed counselor in the state of Georgia, I still regularly seek out consultation from other colleagues in this space and even friends. And I take part in consultation groups within the practice that I'm a part of. So take all the help that you can get, really lean into those resources, because that's how we learn sometimes about different approaches that we might utilize with clients, but we also learn about ourselves. So if we're thinking through the things that we should consider when we're utilizing creativity, we want to think about ethical considerations. We want to consider developmental concerns, and we also want to think about multicultural concerns. And these are just very like high level pieces, but they can really impact the work that you do. So while you're here, what are some of these creative approaches? And in putting this together, I shared some of the things that I myself had developed, but also I gave some credit to people that maybe I've adapted things from or I've utilized different approaches from. And so I wanted to actually help you leave this space with some really tangible things that you might be able to use in your future work with clients. So I can't have a conversation about creativity without discussing the importance of play therapy. I'm working towards my registered play therapy credential in the work that I do with children and adolescents, but I utilize play in a lot of spaces, and play and creativity in the counseling space can really go hand in hand. So play really is just a number of different treatment methods that can be used to incorporate play in a therapeutic space. And this allows children to address and resolve problems in their own ways that feel comfortable to them. We utilize it because play is the language of the child, really. It can help children learn adaptive behaviors and build different kind of interpersonal relationships with either yourself or with others in their life. It can promote cognitive development. It can provide a distance from their problems. And so if you think about as an adult, things that you want to avoid or problems that you want to avoid, children also have those things. And so sometimes it can be safer for them to work through some of those problems utilizing play. And then it also allows expression of thoughts and feelings that are appropriate to development. It's going to be hard to ask a 6-year-old and to tell you about how they felt when X event happened. But if they can show you through play, they might be it might be easier for them to discuss what was going through their mind, how they were feeling, thinking, or acting during that time. So it can just be a more appropriate way for them to work through developmental concerns. And so if we're thinking about how we might utilize play in this space, then we're thinking about how we might utilize creative approaches. And today we're really going to focus on 3 different pieces of creative approaches. There are many, there could be hundreds that we could list today that we wouldn't even have time to cover if this was an all-day webinar. But I think some of the big ones that come up in the work that I do encompass expressive arts, game-based play, and then narrative writing or bibliotherapy, which sometimes narrative writing can fall under the expressive arts category, but today I've listed it as its own piece because there are specific interventions that I utilize that are specific to narrative writing or the use of books in the counseling space. So expressive arts can really help children express different emotions in ways, again, that are developmentally appropriate. It can help them externalize problems, and it can focus on esteem building. So some examples of this include utilizing art, paint, music, sand tray. There are 101 different resources that you could utilize that are in alignment with expressive arts. These are just a couple of the ones that come up commonly in my work. I have all different types of these materials too for students or for clients to use. So when it comes to paint, we have acrylic paint, we have finger paints, we have watercolor paints, so that there's a wide variety of things for children to choose from. And in the group private practice that I work within, we actually have a craft closet or a creativity closet. And it just has a bunch of different items, stickers, paint, we have shaving cream, we have buttons, beads, all different sorts of things that children might utilize to engage in some kind of expressive arts activities. I also utilize game-based play, which can be a bridge for building connection at the very beginning of the counseling relationship. So in the middle of our office space, we have a lot of different books, games that we utilize that children are familiar with. So we have Uno, we have Sorry, we have card games and those kinds of things. And so off the bat, it provides a sense of familiarity to children that are coming into the space, so it can help reduce stress or worry about being in that space. And it's also stuff that they know how to play, so they feel more comfortable starting off in the counseling relationship when they have something that they know how to do. But then we can also utilize those same games to build some understanding of their emotional management or emotion regulation skills. So I know I've utilized Uno and made it into like a feelings focused game. So certain colors are related to certain emotions, or maybe when we get down to the one card and we yell Uno, we share about a certain experience that we've had in our life. And so we can utilize these same games to foster interpersonal skills, foster more conversation around emotion regulation, or even foster communication around reasons that they're coming to see you in your office. And then narrative writing, I put these together, narrative writing or bibliotherapy, because sometimes we can have common goals within these things. So it can help children learn social skills. Reading books about characters that have struggles similar to their own can kind of help externalize the issue, right, while also aligning with how they feel. So a lot of times you might have children that align with book characters. I've found that this has been really useful recently in my work with some of the clients that I see that are neurodiverse. They might not necessarily like align with children that they're meeting in their school spaces, but then I have some books where characters talk through the challenges that are associated with neurodiversity, and children really align with those book characters, and it helps them to address maybe some unresolved emotions that they have around how they manage like their own responses to problems. And maybe some examples of this can include letter writing, and picture books, utilizing social stories, or playing even the game telephone. And so we'll talk more about letter writing and a little bit more about social stories. Picture books, I have both like picture books and chapter books. The chapter books are often utilized by some of the students that are older, or some of the clients that are older in that space. And we can kind of talk about what they're reading, or sometimes they just choose to read for a few minutes at the start of a session as a grounding exercise, which I'm always open to. A way that I've infused creativity even into that is that if they read a chapter or if they read a couple of pages, they can provide me with like an update of what they've read. They can draw something that they've read. They could play it out in a sand tray. They could relate it back to their own life. So anytime that I'm utilizing these different mediums, I'm trying to get at something that might help me to better understand or connect with the child. I've played the game telephone for those of you that remember that, ever went to grade school and played like games in your classroom. That's that game where, someone whispers something into your ear, like a statement, and then you have to whisper it to the next person in the circle, and it goes around and around. And normally by the time you get to the end of the group, someone has heard something vastly different than what you started with. So telephone can be a great thing to use in a group counseling setting. It can help children learn the importance of like active listening skills. It can help them understand that maybe not everything that we hear is truth, right? Because it might go through some different kinds of mediums. And it's just a way to connect. Kids think that it's a fun game. And so much of the counseling relationship with children is born out of the importance of fostering relationship. So if we think through why creativity is important and how we utilize it in the space, all of these things can help us build connection. And at the end of the day, that's always my goal as a therapist that works with children and adolescents, is to build connection, to build trust. I want them to feel safe coming into my office. And if they can't feel safe, I want them to know that it can at least be a brave space where they can discuss with me concerns that they're having, and we can work together to identify a common ground. So in terms of specific activities, related to expressive arts, I've listed about 2 or 3 for each of them. So I like to use the Feelings in My Heart activity. This is adapted from Spence 2013, which is Feelings Heart. I'm sure that that was adopted from many other people. But how I utilize this activity is that I ask children based on developmental age, so I'm always thinking about developmental considerations, to name a couple of feelings that they feel really often throughout the week. So for younger children, I might ask them to choose 3 or 4. For older children, I might ask them to choose like 6 to 8. And so it's really going to be based on that child's level of emotional intelligence, their developmental age, but also their cognitive age. I've had teenagers that are able to name fewer emotions than 6 or 7-year-old clients. So it all comes back to those considerations. But I ask them to, pick a color for each one and then fill in that heart, showing how much they feel that emotion, like on a week-to-week basis. So we'll talk a little bit more about how I might utilize those different types of prompts, but essentially I've had children come up with a variety of different things. I've had children that sometimes will color in by sections. So maybe they chose anger, sadness, worry, and happiness. And so they choose the 4 colors for each of those, and they color the heart in blocks or big sections. When I did this activity as a student learning about it, I colored mine in blocks because that's what made sense in my head. Like, this much of my heart is maybe mad or sad. This much is happy. But then I've done this with other clients, and I've had them fill it in utilizing symbols. So some students for happiness chose to utilize smiley faces. For sadness, they used angry faces or lightning strikes. For worry, they use like little ghost. And so if I don't put parameters around what I'm expecting from them, I can get a world of different things, which I think is really cool because you can then talk to your client about how they chose to utilize those things. And it helps to kind of like decrease rigidity that you have around what this should look like. So this is a great way just to have an initial conversation about emotions. And I've done these sometimes at the beginning of a session or beginning of work with client, and then way later in the counseling relationship to see if there's changes in their ability to discuss and talk about emotions. I've also even had children sometimes that ask if they can put an emotion outside of the heart, something I never would have even considered if I was doing the activity and had specific rules about how it should be completed. But sure, like, why not put an emotion outside of the activity if that feels aligned with like what your need is in that moment? And so even by them asking to put an emotion outside of the heart, it tells me that maybe there's something going on, right? That I need to ask more questions about that emotion that's outside of the heart. Maybe I need to help them maybe better understand that emotion. So it gives me some insight in a type of like a informal assessment type of way to where I can go next. Another activity that I like to utilize is called Peaceful Garden. I didn't have a picture of it because I don't have one that I've made, just ones that clients have made. And I'm not exactly even sure. I think that this activity was adapted from a couple of different things, but we used it in summer camps that we ran over the summer for social emotional needs for some of the children that we see. And so we had them fold a piece of paper in half, like hamburger style. And so there was one kind of central piece, which I'll go to the next page because it talks a little bit more about this. There was one like central item oftentimes that was in the middle of the creative space. So that could be rock, a waterfall, chair, tree, plant, pond, any of those things. And then they describe or they create a peaceful garden around that. So we had a number of materials just available to them. I remember that we brought construction paper, parchment paper, we brought like aluminum foil, colors, markers, clay, the air dried clay, beads, stickers, straws. And so we really just kind of let them go with it and see what they wanted to include and different things that they might include. And then we talked about how they created that peaceful garden after. And so I thought it might be important and useful to like dig a little bit into prompts that you might utilize. So again, there's feelings heart, peaceful garden. What are some prompts that you might utilize for a feelings heart? So you could say, tell me about the different colors that you chose or how you chose those colors. In my mind, I would oftentimes put red with anger, but sometimes children will choose just a different color to go with anger. And sometimes that choice is totally arbitrary, but sometimes it also has reason and it can tell you and give you insight into why that child chose that. What was it like to complete the activity? Or like maybe how did you feel completing it? Sometimes children might share that they're surprised that they notice that number of emotions. With some of my older clients, they have shared that maybe they didn't recognize they felt this amount of this emotion. And then I also sometimes ask, how did you choose to fill in the heart, especially if it's not in those like colored blocks? Like what was your thought process in filling in this heart? And so again, here you want to think about developmental considerations. I might not ask, how did you feel in the heart to a 4-year-old or 5-year-old? I might just be looking at what they did within the heart versus with like a 15 or 16-year-old, I might be asking, what was your choice behind filling in the heart? How did you fill in the heart? Because they're going to be able to have that more abstract reasoning to provide me with like deeper kind of insight on how they chose to fill in the heart. With Peaceful Garden, you could just say create a peaceful garden using the available materials, but you could also say if you see that children are really stuck, they're unsure what to do, you could provide additional prompts. Or if we go back to like our purpose for creativity, let them sit in the unknown. It's not going to be the end of the world because there's no expectation for what this garden looks like. And so when I'm utilizing creativity in the counseling space, that's my go-to. Like I have no expectation for how this looks like. I just want you to be proud of the thing that you did. And my judgment about this piece doesn't matter. So I'm utilizing a lot of encouragement over praise. I'm really working to situate that the child feels like they're proud of what they've created and that my judgment of that thing does not matter. So again, feelings in my heart, peaceful garden, different kinds of expressive arts prompts that you might utilize in the counseling space. If we're transitioning a bit to game-based play, I utilize a lot of sports equipment. I have a basketball goal in my office. I have a soccer ball, both a soft one and a hard soccer ball. I have a game where I don't remember what it's called, but you have like a sticky pad and you can throw a ball back and forth and it sticks to the pads. I have various little small balls. I have marbles. I have all these different kinds of sports equipment in my office. As I mentioned, we have board games that we adapt sometimes. And then I also play a game called Floor is Lava, which we'll talk about in just a moment. For the sports equipment, sometimes what I have done is I've utilized the basketball. I have a couple of adolescent clients that identify as males, and we have utilized the sports equipment. That's something that they tend to gravitate towards. And so when they come into my office space, I try to utilize that and get them engaged. So I've utilized basketball to play feelings basketball. We stand in different parts of the room. I've already pre-identified them before session and standing in one space and shooting from there. You'd share about something that made you feel sad, maybe from another space, something that made you feel angry. I have also most recently utilized basketball in a different capacity to help children work on impulsivity and decision making. And so I will share with them that they always have two options from where to shoot in the room. One option might be closer but offer fewer points, but it would increase their opportunity to get points because it's probably going to be an easier shot for them to make versus a child that is choosing to stand farther away. The other option might be, they can shoot from a point that's farther away in the room for more points. But the kind of decision that they have to make there is that I might not make it from this distance. And so which one feels like the best decision for me right now. And if my purpose or desire is to win this game, everyone's is different, but if that's the purpose or desire, then I really have to think through like making a choice in the split second, maybe leaning into impulsivity versus thinking through practical decision making. Stakes are low. Like if they lose, it's not a big deal. And I try to encourage that in that space. Like losing doesn't have to be bad. It can teach us something. So that can be helpful for parents to hear too, or caregivers, that like it doesn't always have to be about winning or losing, that something can be gained from the process, right? Rather than the outcome. We talked a little bit about board games and how we might adapt those. And then another thing that I have developed and played with children is Floor is Lava. You probably remember that game that you might have played it as a child too. Like you can step on things, but not the floor. Floor is lava. If you step on the floor, you're out. So I tried to create kind of a visual of how I do this in my space. Again, another activity I've discussed with you all that I work with neurodiverse populations. So another activity that I utilize to help with impulsiveness, with practical decision making, with executive functioning skills is utilizing the floor is lava. So I will take, I have different shapes that I've cut out of construction paper in different colors. It looks a lot like this. So I have squares, triangles, circles. Sometimes if I want to make it more challenging, I have rectangles or hearts. But I cut them out into all different colors and I lay them across the floor in my office. And my directive normally starts really easy. And when I say directive, what I tell the child. And so as we're kind of talking through these, I want you to remember that, you know, some of these activities are more directive, some are less directive, and all of this is on a continuum. Like we might have therapists that utilize creativity just by like having these things in their spaces, and there's no prompt provided around it, and that is maybe less directive or more non-directive, like client-centered approaches, versus on the other side of that continuum is like a really more directive activity of like, this is what we're going to be doing during this time. I kind of fall somewhere in the middle. Sometimes I'm utilizing directive activities, sometimes I am allowing children to explore the space in a way that feels comfortable for them. But if you're asking like, oh, this feels like really focused and attuned, right? Like that is kind of what the intention is that this is more of a directive activity to really hone in on focus on those skills. So like I said, I've created these different shapes, and my first directive or prompt might be like, get from one side of the room to the other without stepping on the floor. Well, there's lots of shapes here. That might be pretty easy. But then my prompt after that might become, get from one side of the room to the other by only stepping on squares and circles. So they have to think through active listening skills. They also have to utilize some reasoning and practical logic. They also have to think through like impulsiveness. If they get to a spot, if they took a path and they get to a spot where there's not any more circles or squares, they might have to restart because they might not be able to make it from one end to the other without stepping on the floor. As we get deeper into this game, I make it really hard sometimes. I will say you can step on 2 red triangles, 1 green circle, and 2 pink squares. And so they have to remember all that stuff in their head and try to move from one side to the other. And so this is even a game that I have shared with parents or caregivers that they can utilize at home with their children. And it's also a game that kids really enjoy and they get really into. So this is kind of some more of that game-based play. And it's okay for you to play too. This activity also shows that you can also offer help and that children can ask for help. Sometimes they're afraid that asking for help is like weakness, or they're feeling really stubborn, they don't want to ask for help. I've used this as a tool to help clients open that conversation around like what it looks like to ask for help. And then the last kind of category I wanted to talk about today is focusing on narrative writing and bibliotherapy. So this can include social stories and also letters to self or other. So how you might consider social stories, if you're familiar with neurodiverse populations, which is again some of the work that I do, sometimes there's challenges with social skill building. And so social stories are designed to help children walk through social situations and come out kind of with a better understanding of how they might conduct themselves in those situations. So there's social stories on so many things. I oftentimes will utilize online resources that are free to either adapt, create, or get social stories that other people have developed, while trying, obviously I give them credit if I've pulled it from an online resource. And so I've created social stories around like personal space, that has been really important in working with younger children and what is kind of maybe safe touch versus unsafe touch. And so sometimes we'll print out those social stories and read them together, and then they can color them in or develop them further. And we actually laminate them in my office and put them together with binder rings, and they get sent home so that they can reread those stories. And they can also share them with their parent or caregiver. I've also had children where we work together to create the social story. Like if we are having a conflict with a friend, what would be maybe our next step in addressing this conflict with our friend? And then have them actually develop and create the story themselves. You might also, if you have a child or a client that's super into like superheroes, you could have them create a superhero social story about a challenge that they're experiencing and how they might walk through that social challenge. And so this is just a really cool way. Again, we're externalizing the problem some, but we're also making it to where maybe the child can align with that character. And then as far as our letter to self or other, I thought it might be useful maybe here to provide some prompts in terms of what you could ask. And so again, these can be more open-ended. They can also be more specific. If you're thinking about utilizing letter writing in particular, think about the developmental level and cognitive level of the child. I am working with some children right now that it is like really stressful for them when they spell things incorrectly. And so their whole focus is asking me how to spell every single word. And so what I try to do is return accountability and responsibility back to them in that space, because it also returns power to them. So, oh, I know you're really wanting to know how to spell that, or it's important to you that you spell it correctly. We're just doing our best. You can be proud of the option, or you can be proud of what you tried to create, anything like that. This can be a space where too, it can challenge the rigidity, right? Like my story has to be perfect. My letter has to be perfect and spelled correctly. Well, does it, or is there space there where it's okay if things are not exactly right? It's okay if it's not exactly how we wanted it to be. And so it can challenge some of that rigidity again. But if I'm having them write like a really focused letter, I might reserve this activity for some of the older adolescents that I work with. So again, I can make it more open-ended, write a letter to your future self, write a letter to someone that's hurt you. But I can also be specific in how I address these prompts. So maybe one of the prompts that I include is I want to tell you, if they're writing it to somebody who's hurt them, when this happened, I felt, it frustrates me when, I wish things were. So I have included some of these prompts sometimes and then left things open-ended for clients to complete the sentence or to share more information utilizing these specific prompts. So again, open-ended or specific, but consider developmental level. Consider also ethical piece. We're not going to be sending this letter. That would likely be inappropriate. But if it's to a parent or guardian, maybe we could share it with them in a session, a family session. And so I've spoken some to the work that we do with parents and guardians. So I feel like before we kind of leave creativity behind today, it's important to discuss, how do we work with caregivers to infuse creativity? So in our considerations, we're thinking back to all the considerations we've already discussed, but we're also working to approach caregivers with humility to understand that their role is really multifaceted in how they serve their child. So it sometimes is really hard. Caregivers are balancing a lot of different things, and maybe we only get to see like one little snapshot of something that they're doing that's not working. And so I always try to approach with humility around like, what are we doing that is working, or like what is maybe causing some of the challenge? So we also have to consider family dynamics and cultural context, because we might not understand based on our upbringing or our cultural background what a family is doing, but it could actually serve them very well, or it might be related to their cultural identity, and to like misalign with that, or to provide any kind of resistance to that in any way, it might be like really hurtful and harmful to them. And so are there ways that we can assess cultural identity and context and then provide intervention or assistance with that in mind? How can we assess need? And then how can we challenge expectations that caregivers have? Sometimes I have parents or caregivers that are like feeling really frustrated with how their child is doing something, and it's mostly because it's not the way that they might do it. And so are there ways that we can help to challenge their own expectations of how things should look? And sometimes that through utilizing creativity with them as well. So what does that look like applicably? Like how do we actually apply that to the situation? I utilize parent education and consultation sessions often. So I try to meet with parents of the clients that I work with it just depends on the client, but I try to meet with them to talk through, like, here are strategies that I'm utilizing. I'm wondering how it would look to utilize this at home. Is that helping create a calm down corner at home or create a space that they can utilize to express emotion? I also utilize family therapy sessions, sometimes utilizing filial therapy to teach parents some of the strategies that I'm using in that space. And the language that comes along with utilizing those strategies, which tends to be like very play, therapy focused language. And then I'm always providing them with further resources, and I'm trying to integrate creativity into that space. So even with some of my adolescent clients, I've implemented like a feelings journal to where if it's really challenging for them to talk to their parents about their feelings, they can talk about them through their journal, and parents and child can write back and forth, and it tends to take some of the pressure off of that verbal interaction and place it instead in just building communication, which is what my goal is always. So as we're closing out, I'm hoping that you can remember a couple of things. It's important to lean into that creative side. Everybody has one. I feel like as a beginning practitioner, I would tell myself like, I'm not a creative person at all. I'm not very good at art. I'm not very good at crafts. Oh my gosh, that is literally exactly what I'm telling clients. Like, it doesn't matter, right? We can challenge the rigidity. So I had to challenge my own rigidity around utilizing creativity, because I oftentimes was just straying away from it because I wasn't comfortable with it. Like, if you all could just see what I can draw, it is not good. I cannot even draw like a dog. It looks like a really poor stick figure. But again, that is not the purpose of utilizing creativity. It's just to open like an expression outlet. So the focus is not on how good something is, right? It's on the process of doing it. Utilize the different resources that are available to you. Do not recreate the wheel. You don't have to come up with everything on your own. There's a wealth of knowledge, and there's some resources that I've utilized in this presentation that I would draw you to. Like, people have created so many resources, and so try looking at adapting them if they're not working specifically to your need, or look at just what else is out there. There are so many websites that offer some really cool thoughts or activities that could be used in individual or group settings. And then, of course, remember to play and have fun. In the work that we do with children and adolescents, we are having a lot of fun and we're playing. And that's a really cool part of our job that not everybody gets to say that they do. And so when I leave work, this is not every day, because again, there are days that are really hard, but it's fun for me to think that I got to play and have fun with the kids that I work with. So all that being said, creativity can be a beautiful thing to infuse into the counseling space, because it can offer you just so much more to work with, and it can offer you a way to connect with your client. And I would love to, if we have some time, open the floor to some questions. But again, there's the references here, and then I'm sure my contact information will be shared, but I'm happy to address some questions now if we have some time.
Yes, thank you so much, Kyndel. I was taking a lot of notes. So just some really, really fun things to do with youth. I'm always looking for other activities. We do have a couple questions in the chat, so I'll go through those. And if there are others, if people are still typing, please feel free to do that. We have a couple minutes here. The first one was just related to if there's any cautions or hesitations if you aren't, say, trained in play therapy. Are these strategies still okay to use, or any recommendations you would have if somebody's not trained in that?
Yeah, of course. So my first kind of suggestion is to seek out spaces in which you can learn more about play therapy approaches. Like I mentioned at the start of this, I don't have my like registered play therapy credential. I've done a lot of work with children and adolescents. I have sought out supervisors and consultation from people who work with children and adolescents and have helped me hone in on my own skills and learn more about them. But there's definitely ways to infuse creativity into this space, even if you don't have this wide breadth of play skills. And I think that that's the beauty of creativity, is that we can just think about different ways that we could maybe utilize something we do in our everyday life in a creative way in the counseling space, because really our goal is just connection and kind of expansion of what this space offers to the client. So I definitely think that you can still utilize these resources without having a wide play background, but I would lean into the resources that are available to kind of help you in that process.
Yes. And a question here about engaging youth who maybe have a little attitude? I mean, if we're thinking about adolescents and they're not really excited about doing some activities, any strategies for getting them more engaged if there's some resistance?
Oh, yes, that is such a good question. And parents ask me that all the time, and so do the students that I teach. So sometimes your only job is to try to connect, and like maybe the client's not there yet. Similar to the work that I do with adults, sometimes I have to tell parents or caregivers, like, I don't know that this is working for your child or that I'm the right fit. Like, I'm never trying to force something that doesn't work, because I don't want therapy to be a space that's really negative for them. But on the flip side, I think it really takes time to build trust and rapport with adolescents. And so you have to dig in and kind of do work on the front end before you can get into any kind of exploration of emotion. So I think about, I'm working with a couple of adolescent boys. If you can imagine, there was some pushback from the start when they saw that they were coming to see me and they were coming to see my office, right, on a weekly basis. Like, this is dumb. I hate it here. You're lame. I've heard all the things in the book, some much meaner than that too. One that specifically stands out is a client that I set some boundaries around playing with basketball with. And so some of those boundaries were broken, and enforcing those boundaries when he came back meant that we weren't playing basketball. So for the first 30 minutes, he just sat and said, I'm not going to speak to you. So we sat in silence, and I used silence. And then I just kind of doodled in the corner. Like, I'm trying to meet them where they're at. I'm trying to engage with them in the ways that make sense. And I could tell he needed space in that moment. So I think some of it is also like reading the room, understanding like comfortability with self and comfortability with clients, sitting in uncomfortability. And so we sat for 30 minutes, and I just kind of doodled, and eventually he came around and asked me what I was doing and had some interest in it. And we were able to talk about the fact that he was really frustrated with me. And it strengthened our relationship so much for him to just see I wasn't going to leave him when things got tough, that I was going to stick it out, and that I was also going to challenge him to be uncomfortable. And since that time, we've had to revisit that conversation a couple of times, but it's always been much more fruitful in terms of we have some trust built and we can talk about things that are challenging. So know when to refer out, but also put in some of the work. Like, it can be challenging, but you can also get a lot from it.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone else is wondering about using these strategies over telehealth. So if you're not meeting in person, any recommendations for that or experiences with that?
Yes, COVID was rough. I will say, as a general rule of thumb, I really try to see clients in office that are under 10. That's just a me thing. And I recognize that that is a privilege that I have and that my clients have. So that's not always accessible for everybody. I will say there are a number of different resources that might allow you to utilize some of these things in an online space. If you have a HIPAA compliant version of like Zoom or another platform like that, there's oftentimes like a whiteboard kind of situation or something like that that you can utilize for drawing, painting, virtual painting, that kind of thing. There's also virtual sand trays. I didn't link them in this presentation, but you can click in and type for like a virtual sand tray and that will come up. I utilized that during COVID. I also utilized music during COVID. So I would have clients pick out songs that really aligned with them and like kind of matched how they were feeling, and we would listen to them together because that was something that we could do in a virtual space. We even talked through like some of the lyrics and what they meant to the client specifically. So that was a really cool way to do it. And then if I have younger clients that I'm working with in a virtual space, I really do a lot of pre-planning on the front end with parents around like accessible materials. Can we make sure that they have access to like crayons, markers, sometimes glue, things that would be okay for them to have without immediate parental supervision in that space. But normally parents are just like a room away, even in the virtual setting. And so that's some ways that I've kind of moved around, like not being able to be physically present with them. But it's a great question. I think you sometimes have to work hard to create space to use expressive arts and creativity in virtual settings, but it can be doable.
I really like that idea about the songs and the lyrics. Like that's
Yeah.
such a connecting piece too of listening to music together.
Yeah.
Maybe time for one more. The last question here is about maybe working with parents who are divorced and maybe there's not agreement among the parents, and then how to support the youth through
Yes.
that?
That is so tough. I'm going to be very honest with you. I don't know that there's like a hard and fast rule for how it should be done. I'll share kind of my approach to doing that work. I try really, really hard to work with families that are at least on the same page about what they want for their child. And so with that being said, I really refer out if there's like high conflict, because the last thing I want to do is get into a session with a child and then be pulled for some reason, and then we've started a relationship and that there's like another failed space where they haven't been able to further build out relationship with me. Like it's another transition that they'll have to go through in an already overwhelming space. So I try to get buy-in from both parents from the start. And so just kind of like a rule that I employ, which again, a privilege that I can employ it, but it's something that I do, is that I ask to get consent from both parents before we start this process. Sometimes, at least in the state of Georgia, parents can have rights over all medical pieces. That differs by state. So you want to make sure that you know kind of what you're getting yourself into when you're doing that. But regardless of that, I still want to have communication with both parents and get consent from both parents before we start the work, because I want everyone to know that we're on the same page. And that is that the child is the client, not the two parents that I'm working with, but that I'm always trying to serve them in the ways that will best suit them. And so parents that I've worked with have generally been pretty open to this. And I just tell them, like, we're going to be open in our communication. I'm going to reply all to emails that are sent to me. But these are all conversations that I have on the front end of that relationship, so that parents are aware, like, this is kind of how I do this work. I would encourage you to think through what you want that process to look like for yourself. And then I have a list of people that I refer out to that specifically focus on areas of like high conflict divorce, if I feel like I'm not going to be a good match for a family, because I recognize that sometimes that is important, especially if there's DV, intimate partner violence, things like that included, where there is some level of safety that we have to uphold. I want to make sure, of course, I'm always keeping the client and a parent or caregiver safe. So I will refer them to other resources during that time that can better suit their needs. But I think that that definitely is a challenge and just something to think through how you might address on the front end.
Thank you so much, Kyndel. This was wonderful. Really enjoyed having you here with us. And to all the attendees for your questions, you will receive a follow-up email with the recording of this session and also Kyndel's contact information in case there are some lingering questions that pop up later. This session will also be posted on our YouTube channel, so if you'd like to view the recording there, you are welcome to do so. Thank you again, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you.